interdisciplinary water research. My name is Zhao. I'm a professor in the economics department, CANR at Econ, and I direct environmental science and policy program. And for me as an economist, I tend to view the world in the lenses of demand and supply. So when I see opportunities, I don't really hear opportunities. What comes to my mind is demand. Okay, so if you look at the world, you see that, okay, as a student, you look at, you're taking courses, thinking about what to do in your research. One thing, at least for me, when I was a grad student, that comes to the mind is, where is the demand? That is, where are the opportunities? And increasingly, what I see is the level of demand for interdisciplinary scholarship has been increasing and increasing, not only in the US, and it's really throughout the world. Okay, so today, I'm really happy that we have a panel of distinguished scholars who have been doing research in very different areas. So I'll start from here. Phoebe has been, she's in forestry. She is from the College of Ag and Natural Resource. And Dave Heineman is from geology, that is in the College of Natural Science. And Fanny is from engineering, and Stephen is from social science. He's in sociology. So we have a panel that is really coming from vastly different angles. And each one of them will be talking about, I guess we will start with each one of them giving a short overview of their thoughts about opportunities in their research areas or even broader research areas, both at present and also in the future. For many of the students, that's really what you're going to be looking at is future research opportunities. And then we'll just open this up for questions and answers. Okay, let's get started.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for coming. So I'm Phoebe Zarnetske. I have a joint appointment in forestry and fisheries and wildlife. And I've only been here a couple months, so I'm really new. But I do have a lot of interdisciplinary research experience, and I'm really excited to be here on this panel and talk to you about that. So for my PhD, I worked on coastal dunes in Oregon and Washington. So that system is really dominated by a lot of physical forces, a lot of ocean-derived sediment coming into the shore, wind carrying that sediment, and then it's trapped by this vegetation that actually helps build dune features along the coastlines. And those dunes then provide a lot of coastal protection for people. In the Pacific Northwest, so these dunes are dominated by invasive grasses. So it's kind of interesting sort of system to study because it provides a lot of important ecosystem services for humans and coastal protection, but at the same time, these invasive species cause a lot of changes to the natural system. So as a community ecologist, I'm really interested in looking at those interface environments and those sort of complex questions of systems that may be able to provide services, but at the same time, have some disadvantages to the system. So on that project, I worked with a lot of engineers, geomorphologists, mathematicians. So it was a really diverse project to work on. It was sort of my introduction to interdisciplinary research, and I was hooked. So I'd like to say that, from that project, I think I learned that, doing research with a lot of different scientists from different fields is, number one, exciting, but number two, can really open up a lot of new insights that you would never be able to gain on your own if you were just doing it, in your study area. So it's a really valuable opportunity. And I'll just explain a little bit about the research that I do now, which is looking at the interface of climate change and how that's affecting species distributions, how those species might be able to adapt to climatic changes through space and through time. So I work on a variety of systems, including looking at breeding birds, but also fish in the Arctic. So I have a lot of diverse systems that I work on, and that sort of lends itself to a lot of interdisciplinary research.
So I'm Dave Heineman, the chair of the Geological Sciences Department. I'm a hydrogeologist. Been here 17 years, and my PhD was in hydrogeophysics. So the idea that I was looking at back then was, how do you combine high-resolution characterization from geophysics with hydrologic methods? So basically imaging the subsurface to get parameters that we really care about, how fast water moves to the ground. When I came to Michigan State, I followed up on that and have continued to do some hydrogeophysics work, but the program has really evolved through time. Most of the work that we do now is highly interdisciplinary. We're looking at a broad range of issues, but the core to all these is land use change and climate change and the impact on hydrology. So we collect a lot of data and we do a lot of modeling. As a hydrogeologist, we'd always be modeling how transport moves through the subsurface and trying to figure out how that works in detail. Did reactive transport modeling, did a whole bunch of things, but then we looked up and said, well, where's the water come from? How much water actually percolates down into these systems as recharge? And it turned out, especially in humid areas, very few people were looking at that, especially with interdisciplinary teams. So we developed a code that implements this complex synthesis of all this data and says, everywhere in space and time, in a predictive way, here's how water moves through the subsurface systems. And if you can figure out where the water is moving and predict the flows and water levels and things like that, then you take the next step and say, what about the things that move with the water? Nutrients, contaminants, microbes. And so we have, currently in our research group, we have about 12 active research projects that are all funded, and they range from looking at smaller scale things, like if you change the Higgins lake level structure, what will that do? To fracking and the impact of water withdrawals on fracking, to sustainability of water across the whole High Plains aquifer system, and many others. But really, opportunities in hydrologic science, there's so many opportunities, and the thing I'd encourage you to do is make sure that you do cross over some of these barriers. So I started out crossing across two, geophysics and hydrology, and now I work with huge teams of people all the way from social sciences to physical sciences, climate, hydrology, microbial health. And the thing that for me is really exciting is every day I learn. It's always exciting to work with this broad range of people. Interdisciplinary is not always easy, but it's always exciting.
Absolutely. My name is Mantha. I'm a hydrologist in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. I'm here on campus for about 15 years, 12, 14 years, I forgot. It's forever, right? Now, one of the things, as Dave said, is hydrology by its very nature is such an integrated discipline that very soon you look around, it's not just limited to hydrology in the classical sense of the word. So you have to, if you're serious, you have to work with others. There's no other way of doing things. So that's, and then talking about my background a little bit, I was very fortunate to have had the opportunity to work with some really bright scientists early on in my career. My advisor is a professor of atmospheric and oceanic sciences, one of the lead authors of the IPCC climate change report. But he was trained as an engineer, but he never thought of himself as an engineer. He did everything that you see a scientist doing, and I was really fortunate to have worked with those people. And I continue to work with several colleagues, and I learn from them every day, and it's really fun. Talking about research in my own group, we are really excited about large-scale hydrologic modeling. I don't even know if hydrologic is the right word because we do a whole bunch of hydrodynamic modeling and limnological modeling. So if, probably the best way to describe it is to large-scale environmental modeling, probably to describe it a little better. But we are really interested in making predictions. Things like, can we predict bacterial contamination at beaches? What does that involve? It involves linking your watershed models with your lake models, fate and transport types of questions, and then making sure that these models that are talking to each other, they are compatible in some sense. Because one of the problems you run into very quickly is you have models that just makes no sense to kind of link them together because it's apples and oranges. So how do we make physically based or process-based models, and how do we make these predictions at large scales, where that's where all the management is taking place. So how do you do that kind of thing? And so very soon you realize you have to do interdisciplinary research. And again, as I said, I was fortunate to have worked with some legendary researchers and having them as colleagues, including John, who is here, and Dave, and several others that I worked with on campus. That's really
And I'm Stephen Gasteyer. I'm in my 5th year in the Department of Sociology. And so I come from a background of getting trained, being sort of an applied policy person, I suppose, in research labs in various places around the world, and then eventually getting a degree in, first a master's degree in rural sociology, where I looked at the dynamics and the perceptions of landscape change in the southern West Bank of the Palestinian territories. And then doing a dissertation on the community dynamics around source water protection in the United States. So and my background's a little different than, but I think it's actually a nice kickoff in terms of opportunities for students. I went immediately from getting my dissertation. I had some family reasons that we needed to be back in Washington, where my family's from and where my wife's family's from. And so I worked first in a small sort of activist nonprofit as a research consultant, and then got a job with nationally funded, government-funded nonprofit working with small community water systems across the U.S., looking at trying to implement improved water and sanitation systems. So I bring that sort of bundle to the work that I've done as a sociologist back in the academy. I will tell you that on the one hand, if you're interested in doing policy stuff, there are tremendous opportunities. They need people in the policy realm who can understand something beyond the politics of what's happening. And there's a real interest, especially in the nonprofit or the consulting world, for people with PhDs. The flip side of that is the reason I got back into academia was that you end up being sort of, it's one thing, we all complain about how Congress is working. If you're in the nonprofit world and getting government funding, you live with those consequences of how Congress is working. And it's not just whether or not that RFP is actually going to get floated, it's are you going to have a salary next year? And at a certain point, one gets sick of that, right? And so that's how I ended up back here. But the work that I've done since has really tried to expand on that, thinking about, and if you will, what I do is the capacity of how do communities gain the capacity to manage water resources, right? So I think of myself as working at really looking at how local actors manage this very, very important resource. What that means then is thinking about what are the exogenous factors, if you will, that influence what capacity the community has. What then are the community dynamics? But within those exogenous factors and those community dynamics is this natural piece that everyone else has been talking about. What are the biophysical factors that impact that? And then based on that management, what are the justice implications? Right? Who gets access, who doesn't? And that's most apparent in my research, one of my areas of research, which is looking at access to water and sanitation both in the U.S. and abroad. And about 2 million people in the United States are listed in the U.S. Census as not having access to complete plumbing resources. There's an even higher number who are listed in various reports as not having, while they have pipes that come into the house, the water that comes in isn't potable, and most people not have got the community water system. So this is actually, this is something that is worthy of consideration and precisely. But then also, how does this play out in terms of who has access to water for carrying out irrigated agriculture, as in the High Plains Aquifer? Who has, what is the quality of the water in the lakes that are near their homes, right? So there's a lot of area to go there, but I've collaborated with Dave and with Joan and with a number of other people in this room, because you can ask that question, but you don't really get at, and you end up giving incomplete answers unless you, as the social scientist, have somebody who can help you interpret the scientific information that's coming that you're ultimately claiming. So, I like that.
Okay, fantastic. Let's open this up and take questions.
So I'll ask, how do you think we do a better job linking the idea of science and that data, gathering the data with advancing technologies to gather that with systems and modeling and mathematics? I mean, basically I see those three things need to be better integrated, especially in both the education and the science at the graduate level. So how do you have some ideas or thoughts about how we might, how to do that better?
I think the first thing that needs to happen is probably interaction among the faculty, just to be even aware that there's new technology that's out there that can be used, for example, a new way of monitoring or a new type of data that I can use, for example. And those are out of the ordinary type of interactions won't take place unless there are, somehow put all the people in the room in the locked door system. But I think those types of interactions are probably legally recognized. For example, in hydrology, I think they would agree that we are beginning to see lots and lots of new types of data. 5-10 years ago, we couldn't even think about having such kind of data. Now, that's opening up a lot of opportunities for us in terms of our ability to test models. And that's a great thing. And I think we need to kind of foster those type of collaborations. That's my 2 cents on that.
So I'll follow up a little bit on that. So there's the types of data that we're getting and information from technologies are amazing, as Phani just said. One of the most difficult things often is getting the data at the resolution that we need for our models. So often there's a point-based data that tells you a bunch about one specific spot, but we need to then carry that across a much broader landscape to say what's happening at a beach or what's happening to somebody's drinking water. And so it's really the pieces that connect these data sets, and that also holds for social science data. So you can know something about how sort of social systems work, but for example, in our High Plains project, we need to have a spatially explicit map of what we think the landscape will look like in the future. And we have to fill that in across the whole landscape we're looking at. So that's why having people like Jinhua involved and having people like Stephen and connecting all these pieces such that a systems model can actually describe it.
So let me follow up on that as well. So I mean, these days, the buzzword in Silicon Valley is big data. So in academia, when I hear the word big data, immediately what comes to my mind is, okay, we have the big data, what do we do with it? And a very natural reaction on my part is modeling. So we have to, we use the data many times. We use quantitative modeling to handle the data, to synthesize the data, to find relationships within the data so that can inform us in terms of predictions, in terms of policy formulations. Now immediately, again, if you're thinking of modeling, what comes next is, okay, we have different models in different disciplines. And when they talk to each other, many times either they don't speak the same language or they're at totally different scales. So in economics, we work on a household scale, and in soil science, sometimes look at a tiny bit of thing. So the question is, how do you get the models to talk with each other? And also, how do we train the students so that when you are working on your models, in the future when you deal with people from other disciplines, how do you handle that? So ESPP now is launching the modeler certificate. So we have a modeler certificate, go to our website, and that is a certificate that actually trains students to basically become an expert in an area that is in your area in terms of modeling. And then in the meantime, you know how to deal with people from other disciplines, how to basically talk with modelers from other disciplines. So this is a start in that direction.
Hi, I have a question. So I do a lot of teaching with non-science majors, and a lot of the issues that we talk about, the keynote speaker even mentioned, we're preaching to the choir. Here's all these issues. I think a lot of us in this room know about them for the most part. How good is this university in making water relevant to non-science majors, non-science graduates? Because I think a lot of them are going to go on to become policymakers. A lot of them are going to become business managers and economics, you name it, lawyers and whatever. And I think they need to be, they need to make water needs to be relevant to them and to their disciplines. How good is MSU doing that? Because I get 82 students a semester, and they take my course, they get, oh wow, that's interesting, but then they go on with their lives, and that's pretty much it. So what is being done? I think it would be for faster without ending up there.
I'll start. I mean, there are sort of remarkable communication tools that are out. Remarkable. There are communication tools, right? There's the Great Lakes Information Network, which posts, multiple times a week on sort of the issues around water in the Great Lakes region. It's journalistic, so it's sort of catching, what's an interesting story. But I think that I'll say, I teach students in sociology for whom most of what I tell them about water is completely new and different, and they're not so sure they care about it, right? I mean, it's not so much at the graduate level, but at the undergraduate level. And if I work hard enough, I can get half the class to think it's important. But it is one of those, I think it is an ongoing issue that we have to think about as people who are concerned about water. How do we get the general public thinking about the issues? The problem is the issues become very complex very fast, right? And so there's a balance between saying enough that people understand the complexity and they don't just jump to the sort of the bumper sticker ways of thinking about water, and on the other hand, saying so much that people's eyes start to glaze over. And I think that's a balance that we really have to be able to work at. It's interesting because I have family in New Mexico, and where it is a scarce resource that everyone is concerned about, almost everyone is thinking about water all the time. And so part of the issue is thinking about how do we communicate. I mean, we have the Great Lakes here, right? How do we communicate those as issues that are things that people should be concerned about and should want to go into careers in?
I would say that the issues you have identified are not, peculiar to MSU. Everywhere, everyone in the world, they are grappling with the same things pretty much. So I think MSU is doing a good job, especially as we're becoming more and more aware of the need to communicate better with this. But I would leave it probably to Jinhua. Maybe you can add more, because that's what ESPP is also about, right?
Right. Yeah, I think, if you look at undergraduate education at MSU, well, let's look at the general picture of the water education at MSU. We have bits and pieces everywhere. You look at fish and wildlife, geology, social science, academic resource. We have bits and pieces everywhere. And a big part of the discussion in the Global Water Initiative is actually to think about the water curriculum. So we have the capacity, and we are adding the capacity. And what is remaining is to really build on the capacity and build on the new capacity to do it. I'm really confident that we will have a much better capacity in water education if we can really get our forces together and do it. Now, currently existing capacity, ESPP is doing a lot of training of our grad students to link science and policy. That's part of our specialization. Now the question is, should we do more? Yes, absolutely, especially in water.
I'd like to continue this discussion. I think it's important. The environmental awareness goes beyond water, okay, is critical to local, national, international economies, welfare of people, so tightly tied to that. And I think ESPP is doing a great job, but here's maybe a missed opportunity. Michigan State is educating how many students? A lot, right? And what is it can we do? What is it that ESPP can do with the university as a whole to get this into the general education of all students? And a model that may be attractive to other universities that train. Because the general public does not seem to know and understand issues involved with all kinds of environmental. And then that includes basic science too, so what are we doing about that? And I think students is a great place to begin. 30% of our population.
I could say a little bit more about what MSU is doing and then talk a little more about what we can do. So there is a lot of education about water and the environment across the whole university, as Jinhua mentioned. So all the way down to the integrated studies and physical science courses, global change, natural hazards. And of course, water and the environment are key to all of these. Now, as Jinhua mentioned, I think really the idea of coming up with a water curriculum is just one for more like a focused sense, but actually having the water community at MSU come together and say exactly these kinds of questions. How do we as a community do a better job of taking these critical issues that are facing society and develop some new courses that are available to the masses of students all the way up to the people that are actually going to focus their careers on things like water and environment. I mean, MSU has probably more capacity than almost anywhere at looking at the environment. It's an incredible place to work interdisciplinary because the barriers are really small. So it's easier for us as a community to get together and talk about what